Good morning to you all. My name is Ricky Bridge and I'm Downer's Group General Manager for Environment, Sustainability and Reporting. Today I'm going to talk to you about Downer's role in decarbonising the economy, focusing on Australia and New Zealand, looking at various sectors that require the greatest effort to decarbonise and highlighting Downer's presence in these sectors. This will provide a segue into the rest of the day where you'll hear from our operational leaders. Now, current data shows that globally society emits around 50 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions each year. This equates to a carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere consistently above 410 parts per million, and increasing, and this is increasing, which is a significant increase compared to pre-industrial levels of 270 parts per million. Now, this increase has been driven by economic and population growth, largely due to society's dependence on fossil fuels. To reduce emissions and achieve increasing prosperity at the same time, society needs to decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth. And this is decarbonisation. Whilst population growth will continue, we are already starting to see the economics of climate change rapidly shifting. And this presents significant opportunities and demands for Downer services. As mentioned by Grant and Julie, Downer is well positioned to service its customers through the energy transition that is necessary to achieve net zero by 2050. So let's first take a look at the Australian and New Zealand government policies and commitments. So Australia has pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, while New Zealand has already passed laws committing to achieving net zero by 2050. So Australia took that pledge to the COP last year. It's yet to be legislated, but the commitment is there. Australia is committed to reducing emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, while New Zealand has committed to being 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. Once again, the Australian government has come under some criticism about that near-term target in its ambition. But despite that, each state and territory in Australia has also set net zero targets by 2050, along with a range of near-term 2030 targets in addition to renewable energy targets. And you can see those on the slide. These commitments are driving capital application, investment decisions, and how we deliver our services and products. Downer's customers, as you know, are predominantly government or government related, and governments have a major role to play in the sectors where the greatest effort to decarbonise is required. These sectors include transport, utilities, and facilities. Now, decarbonisation is presenting opportunities for growth in the private sector as a result of investor and shareholder pressure, and corporations like Downer have set ambitious and net zero commitments that Julie has already discussed. This presents increasing opportunities for Downer to partner with the private sector organisations to help them on their decarbonisation journey, and we expect that this is going to increase tenfold. So let's take a look at the Australian emissions. So we'll get into the sectors now. So let's take a look at the Australian emissions profile by sector. So the major sectors are power generation, electricity, you can see there in blue. We've got transport, we've got manufacturing and construction, we've got industry, and we've got buildings, all of which Grant talked about in the earlier presentation today on the wheel, and all the other sectors that we have a strong and leading presence in, with the exception of agriculture, aviation and shipping, of course. So Downer is well positioned to support the decarbonisation of these sectors that is required for Australia to reach its net zero commitments. Let's now take a look at New Zealand's emission profile. A different profile, slightly different profile to Australia's. Nearly half of, or close to half of, just under half of New Zealand's emissions is from agriculture, with the other major sectors being transport, power generation, mainly electricity, manufacturing and construction. And once again, with the exception of agriculture, aviation and shipping, Downer has a leading presence in all major emitting sectors. And Downer is well positioned to support the decarbonisation of these sectors that is required for New Zealand to reach its net zero commitments. So you're starting to see a common theme. So I just draw your attention to this slide, and this slide is it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Its latest report, the AR6, which was released last year, confirmed the science that we must cut global greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 to have any chance at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century and prevent catastrophic and irreversible harm. So this diagram, or the graph here, you can see, it talks about, I mentioned before that we're currently emitting 50 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see where we are today. You can see there's 5 different scenarios based on different concentration pathways, which equate to different temperatures by the end of the century. You can see that the no climate policies is sending us on a direction of 4.1 to 4.8. Now, a recent supplementary report by the IPCC indicated that we're well on track to reach 3 degrees by the end of the century. So there's a huge amount of effort that's required. If we take into consideration the current policies, and referring to that earlier slide, Australia and New Zealand, and the other commitments made by other countries around the globe, you can see that we're probably going to get to around a 2.5 degree world at best. With additional pledges and targets, we can get to 2.1. The 2 degree pathway was the one that was set at the Paris Agreement in 2015. And back then, we would have been looking at that thinking, geez, 2030, it's a fair way away. However, we have 8 years. We have 8 years to get to that 2030 target. And from the recent IPCC report, that has now increased to a 1.5 degree pathway. So you can see there, the shaded area, just the rapid decline in GHG emissions that is required to achieve that 2030 target, to have any hope in hell of meeting the 1.5 degree by 2050. So I guess the cadence here is that the amount, like as Grant mentioned, the amount of transformation that is required in a short space of time to get those emissions and to decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth is huge. The amount of capital and the amount of investment that is required, it is phenomenal. It is unprecedented. So I think, yeah, I'll leave that slide for that. Moving on from that, so the International Energy Agency released its 1.5 degree pathway to net zero by 2050. And here it is here on the screen, which shows the energy transition required in the key sectors being power generation, industry, transport and buildings. The International Energy Agency modelled that to reach net zero emissions by 2050, annual clean energy investment worldwide will need to be more than triple by 2030 to around 4 trillion. Whilst this is a global view of the energy transition, it is very comparable to what is required in Australia and New Zealand. Once again, I'll highlight that Downer has a leading presence in all these sectors, being power generation, industry, transport and buildings. And at a high level, the energy transition required includes, so I won't go through all of them, but they're on the slide there that you can see. It's no new unabated coal plants by 2021, phase out of unabated coal plants by 2030, no new ICE vehicles and vehicle sales and phasing out of ICE vehicles by 2030, 2035. Overall net zero emissions electricity in advanced economies by 2035. At least 70% of electricity from renewable sources, wind and solar. So right now in Australia, 70% of our electricity comes from coal-fired power generation. So that's a complete flip. And we think about how many years it's taken us to get to that point and how many years, I guess, we've been able to transition and been able to bring some renewables into the mix, and how many wind farms and solar farms that is. Just think about the magnitude of how much more investment in that infrastructure that is required. It is phenomenal. All new buildings are zero carbon ready by 2023, with retrofitting by 2050. So you look at every building out there, you look at the building right here, look at every building, everything that we do, everything that we service. When it comes into the facilities and the building sector, Downer has a role to play. Increasing alternate fuels. So for those sectors that are hard to abate, so where you can't electrify, there is going to be the advancement of alternative fuels such as the hydrogens and your biogases and other forms of synthetic fuels. And then, of course, we've got carbon capture storage. So the International Energy Agency has recognised carbon capture storage as one of the key technologies that will get us to a net zero by 2050. Once again, Downer plays in this space. I'll move now on from that into this next slide, which talks to you about the federal government released Australia's long-term emission reduction plan. Underpinned by Australia's technology investment roadmap, it provides a strategy to accelerate development and commercialisation of low emission technologies to achieve Australia's net zero commitments. The low emission technologies that will enable net zero across multiple sectors, as you can see on the screen, include low emission electricity, energy storage, electrification, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, and other emerging technologies. Once again, common theme, if you look on the left-hand side, the major sectors: electricity, building, transport, industry, mining and manufacturing, agriculture and land. Now, we play in all those sectors, although we don't play too much in the agriculture and land. But I'm sure you're going to hear from Jim Kapanelis a little bit later on, and we are involved in some pretty unique technology when it comes to wastewater treatment plants, whereby you gasify the biosolids and you turn that into biochar, and that becomes a land application that sequesters carbon. So it increases the uptake of carbon in the soil. It's becoming also another technology that the International Energy Agency and the IPCC, they're all recognising as key to decarbonising by 2050. So I want to reiterate that this is a federal government pathway, and once again you can see that major sectors, as I've discussed. So moving on from that. So we now drill down into Downer's capability and are looking at those priority and low emission technologies. And across the top, you can see on this matrix, we've got, I guess, a very simplified version of what Pete was just talking about with program development, program delivery, operations and optimisation, and where Downer plays in each of these areas. Now, when we talk about low emission electricity, it's not just all about renewables, and whilst it will be, we have to transition. So we have to service our existing customers on their journey with coal power generation, gas power generation, the networks and the enabling infrastructure required for them to transition into other fuels. We've heard about the recent bringing forward of the closures of coal power plants in Australia. And by no means is this going to be orderly. We talk about an orderly transition versus a disorderly transition. Now, this is not going to be orderly. Now, that creates opportunities, and we're here for our customers to support them through the uncertainty associated with that transition. So then it is, as I said before, it's about flipping that 70% and having of coal-fired power and having 70% renewables with wind, solar and hydro. And also looking at the enabling infrastructure, and Grant touched on it. You're going to hear more about that from Mark McKay later on, around just the magnitude of what's required in terms of upgrading our electricity network here in Australia and New Zealand, taking it from a centralised dispatchable energy source going into renewables, and basically changing that entire network, which looks at the battery storage and all the other things to make it a reliable and secure and stable network. So when you get low emissions electricity, we can then move to electrification. And this is the pathway, I guess, that globally everyone is looking to go down, where it's achievable. Electrification won't be for every situation. And so we look at the buildings, the roads, the rail networks, and the infrastructure. So Steve Kakavas will talk to us about the rolling stock, and so in that case, our networks, the rail networks are already electrified, but there is a lot to do in terms of efficiency, reliability, the rolling stock that sits on that network, and it also will need upgrades as time goes on. So again, when you start thinking about the magnitude of electrification that is required, it's actually meaning we're going to be generating more electricity than what we do now, but it's just going to be from different sources and different networks to support that. With that electrification, we're going to need energy storage. Now, Downer plays, as you can see by the ticks, we play in all these spaces, in all those low emission technologies that I've just talked about, including energy storage. Now, where we don't play in the energy storage at the moment is pump hydro, but I'm sure we've got the capability to enter that market if we choose to. We then look at energy efficiency from the facilities and the buildings. I've touched on that. We talk about the alternate fuels for those sectors that are hard to abate. And then you start looking at the network, such as Dante will talk about the road network. So whilst the vehicles might be operating off electric vehicles, might be operating off hybrids, might be operating off hydrogen, there is still a road network that needs to support those vehicles. those road networks will need to become smarter, they'll need to become electrified, and with that comes automation. So again, a lot of opportunity in that area. I've talked about carbon capture storage. We are probably one of the only or one of very few service providers in Australia that have got capability in carbon capture, use and storage, and I'm sure Pat will talk about that. I've talked about the land-based solutions, talked about the soil sequestration using the biochar, and they're also keeping a very strong eye on other emerging technologies. One that comes to mind there is the carbon removal technology such as direct air capture. Now this is an emerging area and it's also been recognised by international agencies in terms of the role that it will play in decarbonising. We'll keep a strong focus on that in addition to new technology with batteries and other forms of technologies that come available. Now that's not an exhaustive list of everything we do, but it gives you a good flavour in terms of the areas that we play, the areas that we don't play, and those low emission technologies, and you would have seen that thread all the way through. So thank you for your time. I think I'll end it there, Grant, and hand back to you.